joining us today for our secular speaker series. Somebody pointed out to me because we call it Rage Friday since we get so angry, but I can't remember who. I think maybe it was Hondo who's on our board and said it's more like Hope Friday because being around so many people with a funny chat going on does definitely give me hope. So we might have to I guess, informally rename it again. Anyway, go ahead and take a moment to check in the chat and make sure that you switch from hosts and panelists to everyone so that we can all see you, know that you're there. If you know of any pro-democracy events happening this weekend or in the coming week, let us know about it. Secular AZ was invited to table at the Arizona Young Dems Day of Action. So that's going to be happening tomorrow at Phoenix College from 9 to 1:30. I'll be there with some of our new banned books, not or banned bigots, not books t-shirts. So you can stop on by and pick one up if you want to. But for today, we are having another Science Friday. This is very exciting. We are speaking today with Riley Black. She is a science journalist and the author of When the Earth Was Green, Plants, Animals, and Evolution's Greatest Romance, winner of the 2024 A Friend of Darwin Award. Any friend of Darwin's is a friend of ours. And The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, winner of the 2023 AAAS Subaru Prize for Excellence in Science Books. Black's latest book is described as a tale of evolutionary romance between plants and animals played out over hundreds of millions of years. Primordial coal swamps crawling with giant insects, hungry dinosaurs munching on prehistoric horsetails, sabercats rolling in ancient catnip, and even our own early ancestors clambering through the trees. When the Earth Was Green draws from the latest scientific discoveries to lushly reconstruct critical moments of connection that have shaped life on Earth. That sounds like an awesome book. So I'm very excited to hear everything that you have to say today, Riley.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to doing something fun in paleo on this Friday. That for me is not dire wolves. I wonder if it's okay to mention it in the comments when we get to Q&A, but that whole thing has kind of eaten my week. So it's nice to talk about fossil plants. That I'm going to share my screen, share this presentation. There we go. Excellent. So yeah, if I will note right at the start, this is going to be a sort of a mini version of the content of the book because it's hard to cram 1.2 billion years of plant evolution into the time that we have. So this is going to be some of my favorite through lines in the book, but it is out and available now, and the audiobook is fantastic, read by Ren Mac, if you enjoy that sort of thing. But without further ado, I am going to jump in the first slide. And I will note that all the illustrations in this were done by Corey Bing and also appear in the book. So when I was thinking about where to start, I wanted to pick something iconic, right? And many of us, I imagine most, if not all of us, have seen, the famous Jurassic Park and Jurassic World films. And one of the icons of that movie, you see it, on the top of Hammond's cane, and plenty of the marketing materials, the whole thing that leads us to Mr. DNA and the park's creation are insects in amber, right? I am sure that you are going to be shocked to learn that Jurassic Park was not entirely truthful about the insects in amber, not just for technical reasons, but even the crane fly that's in that famous bit of amber on Hammond's cane. It's not a mosquito, it's a different kind of insect called a crane fly with like other little bits kind of stitched on to make it look big and impressive. But when I was writing When the Earth Was Green, I thought like, well, how did those fossils form? Because they have this whole backstory, this prehistoric backstory that I feel like we don't often recognize. We often assume that creatures or organisms that are wrapped up in amber are things that are basically pristine. It's more or less you can get that dino DNA from them. But in fact, they undergo their own process of transformation, just like any other fossil does. And it really is all thanks to plants. It reminds me of when I was a kid. I grew up in New Jersey. My grandparents had some kind of conifer. I forget specifically what kind out in the front yard, but it had some limbs that were chopped off to keep it from getting in the way of power lines. And so to use sap, use resin. Resin is basically a tree's natural bandage. It's primarily gymnosperms, especially conifers, that exude this resin. It usually has that lovely dark kind of beer kind of color to it. And it evolved as a way to seal that tree up when it encounters damage. Because if you basically have an open wound, much like us, trees have to deal with this. There's all kinds of stuff that can get into it. If there's a gash, on that bark and into the wood of the tree, boring insects can get in there, fungus or other diseases can get in there. There could be additional damage just from the elements themselves. So it's important to have something to seal that spot up. And this evolved, hundreds of millions of years ago amongst gymnosperms during most of the Mesozoic, as I'll get into a little bit later. Most of the forests on the planet were not made of trees that we see around us now, but things related to ginkgos and pine trees and monkey puzzle trees and things of that nature. So during this one particular time in prehistory, this 50 some odd million year span during the Cretaceous, it's called the Cretaceous resinous interval. It's basically the stickiest time in the history of our planet. For whatever reason, plants that exuded resin, these gymnosperms, just proliferated, particularly in the northern hemisphere in prehistory. And where you have them, this is where a lot of our amber fossils come from. And this is the interesting thing. This is another, I'm probably going to be throwing a whole bunch of shade at Jurassic Park throughout this because it's easy to do. But most of the places that we get these amber fossils from, we don't have a lot of body fossils from, we don't have a lot of bones or bone beds or things like that. So these amber deposits are often the little window that we have, not only into those ecosystems, but also smaller creatures that often are not preserved in the fossil record at all. For example, tardigrades, water bears, those tiny little critters that we always joke can survive anything. The only fossil tardigrades that we have are found in amber because they're otherwise just far too small to really have a chance of being preserved in the fossil record. If you think about, okay, well, what is rock that fossils are preserved in? Often, sandstone, mudstone, siltstone, things made of tiny grains of sediment. But compared to a tardigrade, a grain of sand could be huge. There's no way for grains of sand to preserve something that small, but tree resin can do it. So these are often our windows to these smaller lives that we'd otherwise miss. Everything from lice that lived in nests that fed on the feathers of baby birds to, parts of dinosaur bodies to, insects. There's even an ammonite that's been found in amber, probably a shell that just washed up on a beach and got picked up by the wind and blown into trees that were along the coast. This little ancient Mesozoic moment preserving part of the ocean that we otherwise wouldn't get to see. So in this particular instance, if you imagine a forest in what's now Myanmar about 100 million years ago, you have these forests with big dinosaur-sized gaps in them from when those big creatures are wandering around. And in these woodlands are relatively open. You have a whole bunch of monkey puzzle trees, these conifers that don't have a whole lot of branches kind of up the length of their trunk, but kind of open up into these large canopies at the top. And there's a particular tree that has a gash on it, and it's oozing this resin. And let's say that we've got a little mosquito, who's just had her blood meals, ready to go lay her eggs. And a little bit of wind blows her into that resin. She gets stuck, and that resin covers over her body. This is one of the saddest things, honestly, that I learned writing the book. Sometimes in amber, we can see the struggle marks of insects, as they're trying to free themselves from being trapped in the amber itself. It can preserve things that delicately. That's not the end of the story. That's really just the beginning of it. These trees that are making the fossil record, that dollop of resin that now has this inclusion in it, this mosquito in it. Say it drops off the tree, falls to the ground, by a stream or other little body of water, somewhere where sediment is being deposited, and gets covered over by sand and silt, just like we would expect for a bone or anything like that. Over time, as the sediment covers that over, there are little cracks that form in the resin, micro cracks that are really, really difficult to see unless you're using a microscope. And water that's carrying minerals basically percolates through the overlying soil and down through that resin and into that resin itself. And we know this from studies of petrified wood and other fossilization processes. Quartz in particular is especially abundant in the Earth's crust, as well as some other minerals that are really good for preserving fossils, because what happens is you have this water that's carrying this mineral component. It's percolating down through the soil, through the resin itself, into these cracks. And as that mineral carrying water contacts the biological material, the body of that mosquito, it starts to form basically a rind, a mineralized rind on it. And that rind attracts more basically mineralization. It catalyzes this process in which that tiny, tiny bug is being replaced, down to the facets on their eyes. With this mineralized material. So if you were to drill into the amber fossil, to try and access whatever was in the mosquito, you wouldn't get dino blood or anything like that. You would get basically something, a three-dimensional version of that living thing that's still been mineralized to some degree. And in this way, trees inadvertently created this window into ancient time that we otherwise would not have. There we go. There's my mouse. So one of the things that probably caused some of these gashes on trees way back when were dinosaurs themselves. When we think about ancient forests and the sorts of places where our favorite dinosaurs used to roam, I remember growing up, seeing, Fantasia from the 1940s, and of course, the Jurassic Park films. But so often dinosaurs lived in, very dense, lush, kind of steaming jungles. And they absolutely would have hated that in real life. What we've come to understand, the dinosaurs, especially the herbivorous ones, were mega herbivores. They pushed over trees, they fed on trees and other plants, they trampled down the ground. There are areas that we call dinoturbated. It's a version of bioturbation. So basically like a soil surface or interface that has been so churned up by biological activity, whether that's worms in the soil or a big dinosaur walking repeatedly over it. There are landscapes that basically dinosaurs walked over so often that they made ponds and other forms of lowlands just through where they moved. In terms of forest composition, we see this even in Eastern Africa today. There have been some experiments done, keeping large herbivores like elephants and giraffes and rhinos and things out of certain areas. And in those areas, plants grow much more thick. They grow much more together. You have a different diversity of plants than you do in these more open habitats amongst the savanna and grasslands and woodlands. So basically, if you have big herbivores wandering around, you're going to have big herbivore-sized gaps in the forest. And we also know dinosaurs were probably quite itchy sometimes, in that studies of lice, feather lice, have shown that they had this great diversity during the Mesozoic. They actually go through a mass extinction during the KPG disaster 66 million years ago, the one caused by the asteroid, when their primary hosts also go extinct. So we have every reason to think that there are dinosaurs wandering around, dealing with parasites and things on their skin, much like large herbivores do today, scratching on trees and other stuff to relieve that, and opening up those trees to pour out resin that then preserved other fossils. So this is life creating some of what we go looking for when we go out into the field and look for these fossils. And even beyond that, if you look at this animal, this is a rendition that Corey did of based on Rhepetosaurus from Madagascar. So standard sauropod body plan. Got the tiny head, and in that tiny head, you have a whole bunch of pencil-like teeth that are constantly being replaced, and you've got that long neck leading to this big fermenting vat of a stomach. We think that these non-avian dinosaurs are probably hindgut fermenters, and this is entirely hypothesis just based upon what we can infer. No one's actually found a dinosaur stomach just yet. We got the gut contents, but not the organ itself. But we think that much like elephants and some other large herbivores today, they didn't have the multi-chambered cow stomach kind of setup, that they had a big vat of a stomach, and they basically tried to increase the amount of time plant material spent going through the intestines, basically fermenting and getting as much nutrition from that plant material as absolutely possible. And on the back end, you've got that big counterbalancing tail to help with that really long neck. So why would an animal be shaped like that? We often look at these dinosaurs and feel, well, they're so weird, they're so strange, they're so different from anything that we see around us now. The whole reason sauropod dinosaurs in particular have the anatomy that they do is to basically maximize the amount of plant food that they can eat in a short amount of time. Life was really hard for non-avian dinosaurs. We know from studies of a particular hadrosaur species, so not one of these sauropods, but a duck-billed dinosaur found in Montana, that about 90% of their offspring basically died out within a year. That first year was absolutely deadly for most baby dinosaurs because you're basically popcorn for these big predators that are wandering around your habitat. There are droughts and there are floods and there you get knocked over, disease, anything that can happen to a living thing they had to deal with, and most of them did not make it. At least in terms of withstanding the predatory dinosaurs, getting big really fast was one way to basically get too big to eat. The largest herbivorous dinosaurs, as much as we like to imagine, something T-Rex size going after something the size of an Apatosaurus or Alamosaurus, if you want to make sure they're in the same formation or what have you. That probably did not happen very often, if at all. Once those dinosaurs got to that size, they could easily break bones of carnivorous dinosaurs, trample them. It would be dangerous to attack something so large. But juvenile dinosaurs, small ones, much like we see amongst predatory animals today, those are basically easy pickings, comparatively speaking. So it's in the interest of the herbivores to get as big as they can, as fast as they can. And the fossil record backs this up in that when we look at the babies of these juvenile sauropods, we have fossils of juvenile Diplodocus, for example, several skulls, and other sauropod dinosaurs. Their muzzles are relatively rounded. So you have this herbivore that can't chew. There's no oral processing really going on. They don't have molars like we do or herbivorous mammals today do whatsoever. They just have these peg-leg teeth for basically cropping and snipping, pulling leaves off, and needles off branches, maybe taking the whole branch. But that's about it. It's basically just like clip it, down the hatch it goes. But in the young ones, their muzzles are relatively rounded. And the adults, their muzzles are relatively squared off. And we see this today amongst modern herbivorous mammals in that animals that typically browse, they are looking for high calorie foods. They're looking for nutritious leaves that have a higher calorie content, fruits and things like that. They tend to have that rounded shape because it's really good for being selective and picking what you want to eat. The larger animals with that squared off muzzle, that resembles cows and grazers that we see today, usually have their heads relatively low to the ground. In the case of the non-avian dinosaurs, the sauropods, it would probably be like a lot of ferns, cycad fronds, horsetails, a lot of things that we used to feel were not very nutritious until some recent studies found like, oh no, the dinosaurs could definitely grow their bodies on something like this. So you see basically this dietary shift, and it makes sense given basic physiology that we understand amongst animals living us today, that if you're small, usually you have a quicker running metabolism. You need a lot of high calorie food, whereas when you get bigger, there's this kind of trade-off that happens where you need more food in absolute sense. You need more pounds of food per day. But the quality of that food, the caloric quality and the nutritional quality can be lower. So this is why the biggest animals tend to eat a lot of things like grasses and stuff. They're relatively hard to eat. They're not very nutritious, but it's generally available. Whereas a smaller animal will have to eat a lot of fruits and bugs and succulent leaves and things like that in order to maintain their metabolism. It's kind of the difference, amongst our own relatives of the diets of like mouse lemurs have to eat a lot of these high calorie foods versus something like a lowland gorilla that's eating lower quality food, but that's generally growing all around them at all times. So we see this shift amongst these herbivorous dinosaurs during their own lifetimes. They're trying to pack on as many pounds as they can with this calorie-rich plant food to get to be big enough to evade predation for the most part. And that long neck let them reach relatively high up into the trees, side to side. They could more or less walk out on the ancient landscape. If you think of one of these ancient landscapes like what we see in Dinosaur National Monument on the Utah-Colorado border today, this ancient floodplain of 150 million years ago, streams and ponds are lined by horsetails, and you have ferns covering everything, and these stands of conifer trees. These big dinosaurs basically parking themselves in a spot and reaching high, low, side to side, eating their fill, and they can shuffle on a little bit further and eat some more. It's really maximizing their reach. in terms of bringing this plant food in, which then gets processed and all that nutrition squeezed out of it. And it seems, because we know that dinosaurs were warm-blooded organisms, and metabolisms worked relatively fast, that food, as much as it was they tried to extend it through their guts, it's still moving relatively quickly. So they were probably eating a whole bunch, and that opens this whole other is the area of inquiry, something that we don't fully understand yet, where you could have multiple species of these giant herbivores living in the same habitat, and there's food enough for everybody. The productivity of these ecosystems must have been unusual compared to what we know today, to have in those Jurassic landscapes, Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, sometimes Brachiosaurus or Supersaurus and Barosaurus there as well, 6 or 7 different, not even species, but genera of giant herbivorous dinosaurs, not to mention things like Stegosaurus and the smaller herbivores who are living there. So the complexity and the richness of these habitats is something that's almost entirely unique. The Mesozoic, as much as we try and find places today that kind of resemble it, we're still very much trying to understand the basic ecology of these habitats. But we know whatever was happening in those dinosaur-based habitats fundamentally changed after the mass extinction of 66 million years ago. As we well know, an asteroid about 6 miles wide hit what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. As I talked about in my previous book, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, most of the extinction probably took place in about 24 hours, and this was entirely unusual compared to previous mass extinctions that could take place over hundreds of thousands, if not a million years or more. This one was fundamentally quick in that the impact shot so much debris up into the atmosphere that as it came down, the friction caused by all those tiny pieces heated air all over the world to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit or so. This is hot enough to, broil a chicken in your oven. It's also hot enough to ignite dry forest litter. So you had this heat pulse that's, hotter than anything really on the surface is meant to ever withstand. Forests are spontaneously going ablaze. If you cannot get underwater, underground, there really is nowhere to go. So most non-avian dinosaurs and so many other critters, whether it's mammals, lizards, insects, organisms like trees, fungus, so many forms of life, if you cannot get underground somehow or have a shield against this heat, probably died out within that first day. And that was followed by 3 years of impact winter. So read Last Days of the Dinosaurs if you want to know more about that, but just believe me that it was absolutely awful and absolutely quick. In the wake of it, the iron that was contained in a lot of that debris from the impact got scattered all over the planet into Earth's soils, and it benefited the seeds in the seed bank that survived in the soil of angiosperm plants, basically what we often call flowering plants, even though they weren't the first flowers. That's just kind of generally what we call them. And these angiosperm-based forests started to grow. By a million years ago, we're seeing this new forest composition, and there's nothing big to keep them open like before. The largest animal is about the size of a German Shepherd. So in these forests, you start to get closed canopies. You start to have trees that basically shade the entire ground. That fundamentally changes the nature of the understory of these forests in this warm greenhouse world of about 60 million years ago. And you have multiple tiers of that canopy. So if you're a living thing, if you're one of these surviving, insects, birds, mammals, lizards, snakes, what have you, you not only have, burrowing underground as a possible niche, or living on the surface, or living just at the base of the tree. You've got multiple basically spots in these canopies, in these thick forests, where you could open a new niche for yourself or find resources that you might be competing for elsewhere. And basically there was more ecosystem per acre than there was previously. Because if you think about a more open habitat, if you think, for example, of just like an open grassland, what are your available habitats? You can fly through the air, or you can run on the surface of the ground, you can burrow under it. But that's more or less it in terms of like where you can live. And these closed forests, there's so much more ecological space. And amongst these forests, we have some of our earliest relatives starting to proliferate. So this is a representation of a little mammal called Purgatorius. They could have fit about, in the palm of your hand. Resembled a modern day tree shrew. And so far as we know, they were the earliest primates. And if they were not present for the KPG impact, their direct ancestor certainly was. But basically, these are the earliest primates that we've been able to find. They were living in the trees. They seemed to live in this arboreal lifestyle, scampering around, eating bugs and fruit and things like that. They're, able to get underground into a burrow of some kind during, the worst of the heat and made it through the impact winter somehow. And amongst these forests, the earliest primates really started to take off in evolutionary terms. Within about 15 million years of the impact, we start to get primates that have binocular vision, that their eyes, much like ours, face straight ahead. Depth perception is very important when you're running around through the forest canopy trying to grab bugs and evade predators and things like that. We also got, our opposable thumbs. Primates, have opposable thumbs and toes as well on their feet for grasping and clambering around. They really evolved to, live amongst the trees and weren't really spending very much time on the ground. During this time, grasslands as we know them weren't really present. Grasslands really only started to appear and start to spread as the climate was gradually cooling about 20 million years ago. So prior to this time, so much of the planet was covered in tropical to semi-tropical forests in this very warm world. And, not just early primates, but things like apes really began to spread across the planet late in the Cenozoic. And living in these forests and having these relationships opened up some just really what I think are fascinating, just chance events. And this is kind of a little bit of an aside to, the main storyline that I'm going to get to the conclusion of in just a moment. But we know today that there are primates that live in South and Central America that are fundamentally different from those that we find in Africa and Asia. There's a major primate split that if you've ever taken a primatology course or read a book, you've probably heard of the catarrhines and the haplorhines. So we have, the question has always been, where did the ancestors of those primates that now live in South and Central America come from? Way back before continental drift was, accepted, paleontologists used to think, well, maybe there's a land bridge and they just kind of walked across. But a land bridge of that size between, modern day South America and Africa just never been found. It doesn't exist. We know that, the continents once connected, drifted apart. Continental drift explains this. Well, that raised another question then. Well, how are they getting there? And it seems to have been by rafting. And we see this happen amongst modern organisms today. The little anoles that you can get at the pet store. Amongst islands, off the southeast coast of the US, you often see them basically island hopping unintentionally. They get, storms come by, they rip up a bit of vegetation that this lizard is on. The lizard is basically on a raft at sea and arrives on the beach of a new island somewhere and spreads. The islands are not as isolated basically as we often like to think they are, at least for little things that can survive on these rafts of vegetation. And in prehistory, we also think that this is how, for example, lemurs and tenrecs got to Madagascar for mainland Africa, that they didn't evolve there, but they are basically descended from primates and little tenrecs that used to live on the mainland and also basically got sent across the channel onto Madagascar, where they basically underwent this new evolutionary burst. In terms of the primates that made it to ancient South America, South America and Africa were a little bit closer together when this was happening, in the window of about 14 million years ago or so. And if you have some doubt, if this seems ridiculous to you, there are some videos that you can find on YouTube. I wrote an article about this for Smithsonian a couple of years ago that include a video of some of this. Like if you're imagining just like a woven raft of grass or something like that, that's a little bit too simplistic. Some of these rafts of vegetation have upright trees with fruit on them, still covered in bugs and things like that. So if you are a little primate and you're living on the coast of, the coast of ancient Africa, and one of these storms comes along, rips up, the ground beneath you where you're hanging onto this tree. As long as there aren't major storms, as you're basically being sent across the Atlantic by ocean currents, and there's some food on that raft, you could ostensibly make it to another continent. And we know that this happened at least 3 times just for primates, that there are at least 3 fossil primates of groups that no longer exist that have been found in prehistoric South America. And this is saying nothing of the ancestors, for example, of capybaras that made the same journey as well. So basically, the way that ocean currents worked, the plants that were growing along the coast of Africa during the late Cenozoic, the primates that were living there, and other creatures, all of these things interacted to fundamentally shape the fauna of a whole other continent, some place that was an island for much of the Cenozoic until South America connected North America through what's now Panama. Um, I just find that so wonderful, and that we often think of islands as these sort of evolutionary experiment stations, and they absolutely can be, but they are not as isolated from other places in the world as we often like to think. So plants have done all these wonderful things through evolutionary history. The reason that we breathe oxygen is largely thanks to photosynthesizers, like many of the plants that we see around us now. Um, the fossil fuels that we use and need to stop using are largely from, at least in the form of coal, from these ancient coal swamps that grew, 300 million years ago. Plants, fed so many ancient organisms, helped them move around the planet. All these interactions I go to in greater detail in the book. But one of my favorite examples of these relationships is something that's really easy to take for granted. This is a rendition of Ardipithecus ramidus, one of our earliest humans that we know of from about 4.4 million years ago in what's now Eastern Africa. And if you look at the earliest hominins, they have an anatomy that is still very much suited for the trees. And it was climate change that was going on, basically grasslands continuing to expand, closing forests that put pressure on a lot of the apes that were around during this time to either basically stick with the forests, as chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans in Southeast Asia did. They kind of stuck with those pockets that still remained. But our ancestors started moving along the ground more often. This is why we see the footprints from Laetoli in Tanzania, assigned to Australopithecus afarensis, that we see that toe being in line with the rest of the foot for the big push off, this much more bipedal kind of habit and stance. But early humans prior to that were still very much more connected to the trees still, and we inherited that from them. Basically, the flexibility in our wrists and in our arms and our shoulders comes from ancestors that were clambering around and moving through the trees. So much of what we do, all the stuff that we do and make and gesture with, we can largely attribute to our ancestry in the trees. That trees shaped our bodies and allowed us to do so many of the things that we do now. We develop all this technology that is letting me talk to you, across the distance. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. There are all these stories and connections with ancient plants that are so easy to overlook or just kind of treat as every day. So often in paleontology, we have this trope, dealing with our favorite reptiles, of course, but it's called Dinosaurs in Parking Lots, where you see paleo art of something like a Stegosaurus or a Triceratops or what have you, in this wide open space, and there's kind of monkey puzzle trees in the background, when the reality was fundamentally different. And these are ecosystems that evolved together and forming relationships, whether it's pollination or there's a chapter in the book where I talk about prehistoric catnip and how ancient that connection to cats probably is. This evolutionary accident of this compound plants develop to keep insects away has a strange effect on cats that's been around for probably about 20 million years or so. And that's really my hope for this book. There's plenty in here about paleontology. It's written in this narrative style, as if you were there. In the appendix, I lay out all the science, and I hope people continue to go back to it. But that's my larger hope for it, is that it just changes the way that you see the world around you. Not just stop and smell the roses, but wonder where that rose came from. How is it interacting with the environment around it? Every organism, in a sense, is an ecosystem unto itself. So what seems like a single tree, out on the sidewalk, that also is habitat for a whole bunch of organisms. It's giving off oxygen that contributes to our atmosphere. It has all these relationships with fungus and other organisms in the soil that you can find, a single leaf, a single branch is this thread to start pulling at that brings you to all these other different interactions through time that has created life as we know it now. That without plants, without photosynthesizers doing what they do and undergoing the changes they've gone through. Evolution of life on Earth would probably look very, very different. This is an illustrated example because I'm just doing it off the cuff for this. But one of my favorite examples of this is, our ancestors that came out onto land, the fishopods, things like Tiktaalik and, Acanthostiga, from way back when, before the coal swamps even. They didn't come out onto land because things were drying up or, just for no reason whatsoever. What happened was you had plants that started to grow on land. And in those early, forests and wetlands and swamps, you already had invertebrates that were living along the shoreline, basically feeding upon whatever got tossed up. These early forests could be home to a lot of these arthropods that were coming out of the ancient seas and ancient waterways where there was nothing else alive. It's a good way to basically get a lot of food and not be eaten. And our own ancestors who are living at the water's edge with those little eyes they're poking up above the water, they're feeding on the invertebrates. They're living at the water's edge. And if they move out of the water as well, there's far more resources and much less competition. So none of this would have happened. Basically, like, if not for plants doing what they did, establishing these environments, our ancestors probably wouldn't have come out on the land, or at least not at that time and not in that way. And that's what I love about these stories. That's why I call it an evolutionary romance, is because it really is a relationship. So often in paleontology, we talk in this kind of colonialist language about colonization and dominance and, the invasion of the land or of a new habitat or all that stuff. And I really want to take a different view. It's like, what if we focused on sort of collaboration, for lack of a better term, about these dances, this back and forth kind of relationship in which something new emerges, the creation of biodiversity, as it generates itself, that it isn't just about the ecological space, but it's all these interactions that so often go missed or unseen that make the world as we know it. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and I will be happy to take your questions if my mouse responds to me. There we go. Thank you.
There is a question here from John, and he asks, how did the avian dinosaurs survive to give rise to all of our beautiful birds?
That's a fantastic question. I go into this in The Last Days of the Dinosaurs a little bit. There was a study that came out a number of years ago now, but saying, okay, look, it's the end of the Cretaceous, right? And we have birds as we know them, so sort of modern looking birds with beaks and no teeth. We have toothed birds, which flourished throughout the Cretaceous, and then we've got little, basically raptor-like dinosaurs, like things like a Caroraptor. So we got three small-sized, feathery, bird-like in one way or another creatures. It's only the beaked birds that make it. That might be the essential clue because those tooth birds and the little raptor dinosaurs, they were faunivores. They were eating insects and lizards and things like that. They had to chase down and hunt their own prey, which is obviously going to be in short supply after the mass extinction. But beaked birds are already adapted to eating seeds and nuts and basically other plant materials that would have been shielded in the soil from the heat of the impact and from the impact winch that can last quite a long time. So basically the birds that had already shifted to herbivory were able to get underground during the heat pulse. We know this today that even if you don't make your own burrow, there are plenty of organisms, whether they're gopher tortoises or alligators or snakes or mammals and stuff that make burrows that would have allowed them to escape the heat, have enough food to make it through the impact winter, and then flourish. So it was probably just the fact that dinosaurs had expanded into all these different shapes and sizes, but it was the tiny herbivorous ones that were able to make it. There were probably some others around, so I'm wondering if we're going to find at some point some kind of little Paleocene herbivorous dinosaur in some other part of the world. Most of what we know comes from Western North America, basically Montana and the Dakotas, because you get this great before and after snapshot of what life was like before and after the impact. But so far as we presently know, it seems the fact that dinosaurs were so diverse and successful that they spun off these little beaky herbivores, and that is just what happened to work best in those couple of years right after impact.
Here's another question. First of all, there's a lot of commentary about how smart you are and how we all feel smarter just listening to you talk.
Thank you.
Um, and here's a question from Maddie. What was your evolution from interests as a child to school to diving so deep into these fascinating and complicated subjects? What random accidents contributed to your path?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould was obviously a huge inspiration for a lot of my work, and I love talking about contingency and all the way that things happen. So, I was born in 1983, and this was like as Dinomania was really ramping up. Like, even though that we have dinosaur everything now, it's like you have no idea. If you weren't around during the 1980s and early 90s, it was like, dinosaur bed sheets, pajamas to eat my dinosaur cereal, to watch the cartoon, to go to the museum, to have the book. There's a Bernstein Bears book called like Too Many Dinosaurs or something like that. It's very much that kind of feeling. And I was one of those kids. I absolutely loved them. Um, I wanted to be a paleontologist, and the people who were raising me, my teachers and stuff, I was like, well, if you want to be a paleontologist, you got to go to Montana or something. And I was basically stuck in New Jersey, so I was like, okay. I had no idea that paleontology or vertebrate paleontology in the U.S. basically started in that area on the East Coast. But in any case, I kind of always kept that interest. Went to college. I was going to study marine science and ecology. Really struggled as a student. Not only was I, closeted and dysphoric and had, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but autistic and didn't know it yet. The regular college experience was not well suited to how I was at the time. So I was really struggling. I do great in my science courses, but basic math stuff or physics or Chem 101, I really struggled with. But I'd use my institutional access to read books and papers about paleontology. For like, I want to go right to the source. I don't want to just read the news report. I want to read these papers. And this was, around 2006. This is at the time we just had Kitzmiller Dover happen, Pennsylvania. So the attempt to get intelligent design to schools, which thankfully failed. But between that and like a big Darwin anniversary coming up, everybody was talking about evolution. Everybody was talking about, evolution versus creationism and all this stuff. And there's so many things I thought, like, I wish more people knew about the fossil record and all these amazing transitions, how whales are hoofed mammals and how birds are dinosaurs and things like that. So I started writing. I started with a blogging contest to get some scholarship money. I liked it so much I kept doing it. I got picked up by a website that doesn't exist anymore called scienceblogs.com. That was done by a magazine that doesn't exist anymore called Seed. But that was around the time that I was writing my first book called Written in Stone, which came out in 2010. And Smithsonian picked me up to blog about dinosaurs for them. So really one thing led to another. And also it put me in touch with a lot of experts. I started doing field work, especially once I moved to Utah in 2011. Basically this is where so much of it happened. So much is in driving distance even. So I could finally visit these amazing fossil sites and go out and join these experts in paleontology and looking for new fossil sites. So all this stuff kind of was coming together and made my career what it is. I didn't specifically set out to become a paleontologist and science writer, but I just had this passion for it that kept me going. I wanted to know, and enthusing about it um, brought me to the career that I have now. And I'm incredibly grateful that it happened that way. I think the pathway that I took, especially starting from blogging, isn't necessarily open anymore. Things have fundamentally changed in the media ecosystem since then. But I love the fact that I was able to take, basically my work is my fascination, that I'm always learning something new and always have something new to share. And yeah, that's more or less how I got here.
I love that. That's a great question. Here's one from Erica. There were also aquatic dinosaurs. Why did they not survive the great extinction, or did they die off later for other reasons?
Right. So when we talk about the KPG mass extinction, the dinosaurs are so often the focus, right? But there were mass extinctions of, even surviving groups, or mass extinctions of mammals, for example. A lot of marsupial or marsupial related mammals were more common in North America, and most of those died out and made room for the placental mammals that we see around us now. So for the aquatic reptiles, so there were no fully aquatic dinosaurs. I know there's some debate about the spinosaurs and stuff living in freshwater environments, but we talk about the oceans, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the earlier ichthyosaurs. Those are all other forms of marine reptiles that independently evolved. So they weren't dinosaurs proper, belonged to all these other different groups. They also went extinct, by the end of the Cretaceous, in addition to, the flying pterosaurs and other stuff in the marine realm, like redisted clams, these clams that grew about the size of a toilet or larger, also went extinct. Reef builders disappeared. What seems to have happened, that heat pulse is really just the first day, the first phase. It was absolutely terrible, but it dissipated relatively quickly. What happened over the next couple of years, the target rock that the asteroid hit was ancient limestone, basically made by these ancient reefs, full of these sulfur-based compounds. And we know from our own human activities, we aerosolize a whole bunch of sulfur-based compounds. They're really good at reflecting sunlight basically back out into space. So photosynthesis, geologists have calculated, is probably curtailed by at least 20% for 3 years following the impact. That you also have soot and ash and dust and all this stuff. Ecosystems across the board almost fundamentally collapsed. This isn't about the oceans, but there's a study that came out, I think it was last year, about fungus farming ants, basically the ancestors of today's like leafcutter ants that you might see on documentaries or at the zoo, evolved directly after the impact because at the time, there was so little plant life that there's far more fungus basically feeding on everything that was decaying. And ants began to feed on that fungus and defend it against other insects that might want to eat it. And that began the beginning of this insect agriculture that we can still see around us now. So I just use that as an example to say like ecosystems like fundamentally collapsed, including in the seas. There's a paper, it's mentioned in the book, about coccoliths, basically these discs that are ancient algae, and they've formed these spheres. And when you look at the fossil record across the boundary, the coccoliths that you find before, you find photosynthesizers and ones that we call mixotrophs. They can both photosynthesize and feed on organic material in the seas. After the impact, you only find the mixotrophs for a little while, and it takes the photosynthesizers a little while to come back. So basically, the curtailing of photosynthesis was so strong that ocean algae disappeared largely,
Mm.
that these organisms that are contributing oxygen to the atmosphere, many of them disappearing. You have this broad abundance of the mixotrophic ones. They can still photosynthesize on whatever's there, but they're mostly subsisting on the organic matter. So that's a sign that the oceans almost went back to basically a Precambrian state. It almost went back to just a cellular ocean with no complex life in it whatsoever. It's so fundamentally collapsed. And when you have that kind of rug pulled out from underneath these ecosystems, the larger critters, they're kind of at the top of this food web. There's so few resources. And of course, there are mysteries amongst this. I mentioned this in the book as well, that, where one of the first fossil sites I ever went to in southern New Jersey, it crosses this boundary and we see large crocodiles, this thing called Thracosaurus that make it through. So what resources they were feeding on, how they made it, how it might differ from pocket to pocket, we're still trying to understand. But we have a significant signal that ocean ecosystems were under intense pressure and largely collapsed. So unless you had some trick to be able to get enough food or make your own, chances are that you're going extinct.
There's another question here from John. He says, one theory of human evolution that has intrigued me goes like this. Brain development needs high calorific,
Right,
maybe high
caloric.
caloric,
Yeah.
there's some typos here, but I think it's protein. Let's see, plentifully available from fish in lakes. Early man waiting for fish in shallow water might also explain to transition to an upright gait. Is there any truth to this?
So this is similar to the aquatic ape hypothesis. I know David Attenborough played with this idea in a few specials way back when. It's generally disregarded and considered pseudoscience by most anthropologists that I work with, in that the environment in which we see these major human anatomical transitions happening are in Eastern Africa during a time where it's getting increasingly cool and increasingly dry amongst the spread of these grasslands. There's no, even though we know early humans of various sorts like ate shellfish and were certainly made use of waterways whenever they could, there's no indication that they were spending most of their time there, and for good reason. Actually, some of the fossils from Olduvai are, or I guess we call it Oldupai now, have been found with croc tooth marks on them. There's actually some of these
Hmm.
carnivores that were collecting early human remains in environments where they could be preserved. So there are some hominin fossils from there. I think there's even a fossil crocodile species called Crocodilus anthropophagus that's considered the trace maker for these bite marks in some of these early human bones. So it would not have been even a safe, I think, environment for early humans to really spend a majority of their time. So it's like an intriguing functional idea, but that aspect of, so the human anatomy was formed by wading in the shallows or swimming or things like that has largely been refuted at this point.
Okay. There are lots of compliments here. People are in disbelief that you were born in 1983. And also love your origin story. Let's see. Here's another question. Is there evidence that our species is evolving?
Yeah, I mean, we are evolving all the time, partially because that's just what organisms do every time you recombine genes. In terms of whether we're undergoing like a major transition, I get to ask this, a whole bunch. We are kind of buffered by our culture and technology in that, if we didn't have air conditioning, and had to deal with the warming climate as it is, we'd either have to move or it would be putting selective pressure upon us that would change our bodies. There's debate about like what exactly happens. There's some evidence that like in warmer climate regimes, organisms, especially mammals, become smaller. It's easier to shed heat that way. So something like that might transpire. But at this point, like we certainly are evolving. There's evidence, especially genetically, for example, lactose tolerance and populations of people who become more lactose tolerant throughout history, things like that we are certainly seeing it. It's happening at a relatively rapid clip. So genetically, we're picking up a lot more variation and changing quite a bit. But in terms of sort of big anatomical changes, the kind that we often see in the fossil record, um, we're not seeing anything like that as yet, or at least, really our human species has only been around for about 300,000 years at this point. And the earliest basically modern humans look very much like us. Maybe if we ever get to see the million-year mark, we'll be able to look back and pinpoint some things. But I think at this point, we're genetically evolving quite a bit, but anatomically, it would require a big change for some of those shifts to really have that natural selection push, because this is part of even what Darwin and Wallace came up with, right, is that natural selection can explain transformative change, but it can also explain stasis. And we have plenty of examples. For example, the coelacanth is another one where it's like genetically lots and lots of evolution, but anatomically not so much. So all these things don't necessarily move in lockstep. You can have different forms of evolution even amongst the same clade or species.
Okay. Um, well, and it makes me think of like how all of the plastic and I listen to a lot of NPR and like microplastics and are now like part of our like DNA and stuff, and that's changing us. And I mean, I think it like I think one of the reports I heard is that it can affect fertility. So right, like we're
Mm-hmm.
maybe becoming a little bit less fertile because of our own bad decisions, really. There's another question here from Philip. He says, in the case of primates migrating from Africa to South America on rafts adrift at sea, how many would be needed to give rise to a new and growing colony in their new home?
That's right. We'd need, sort of a population to do this, right? So it would have to at least be two. Um, it was probably a significantly larger number than that. That's a question that I haven't been asked before. So, like, obviously, we need some way to start a population. Um, it could be small. It likely was. And as much as today, I know we are very conservation focused, very concerned when there's a smaller number of organisms. Cheetahs are a great example of this, of like low genetic diversity, and that's been a struggle in their conservation. Then again, we do have counterexamples. For example, elephant seals off the coast of California went down to almost going extinct, hair's breadth from extinction. Very, very few individuals, and they rebounded and have actually quite healthy genetic diversity now. So even if it was likely a very small number, perhaps even single digits, but even that, depending on the circumstances of like what's in their genome and how that those recombinations and mutations happen from there, um, likely gave rise to the populations that we see now. But it's also important to remember that some of these fossil occurrences that we have are singletons so far. So some of these other primate groups that made it, those might just be the ones that made it over from Africa and then were unable to establish a healthy population. We have yet to find the direct ancestors of, for example, the capuchin monkeys and spider monkeys. That we see in South America today. So that's still like, we know multiple groups made it, but how that worked at basically a functional population level is it's hard to get at the fossil record. We're really just getting these small tidbits, but it's a great question to keep in mind.
This is a great question. Maddie's asking, what is a good question to pose to a creationist to get them to think about giving science a chance? Living
That
in Salt
one's
Lake City, I imagine, you have this opportunity frequently.
it's challenging because here's the thing, right? It's that many people who are creationists or reject science do so for non-scientific reasons. It's not like that they've looked at everything and come to a different conclusion. It's that they have a belief that fundamentally conflicts, and a lot of it has to do more with emotion, I'd say, than logic. So I feel like part of it, I don't like the idea of coming up with kind of a gotcha question. But if you're in a relationship with somebody who, and this is key, I feel like that you can't really just do this with a stranger, because you're gonna feel like they're not listening to you, and they're gonna feel like you're not listening to them. It's very difficult to do. But if you're in a relationship with somebody, a friend, a relative, somebody from work, what have you, talking about things like, you know, okay, we've got dinosaur bones, right? And those bones have microstructure, that they're preserved down to that microscopic structure bone, that we can tell how this organism lived, that this was really once a living critter that was replaced by minerals very long ago. And they might have like pushed back and stuff about it, but like talking about like the details that we can get out of it and some of these constants that apply to other aspects of science that they probably already accept. I always love doing that.
Yeah.
Is, for example, like the age of the earth and how long ago things happened, because obviously this is a big topic. This is like a big key one, right? But the way radiometric dating works, based upon the half-life in radioactive minerals, is the same thing that we use in so much nuclear science, or especially when we're considered very much worried about the Cold War very much. Think about like, well, how long would it take, if there was a nuclear blast somewhere, for that area to become livable again, based upon the half-life, this math that we know is consistent and reliable, and we use it for time, and we use it for all kinds of science. And I feel like picking on some of those things that have intersections that they might already have some acceptance of can definitely help. It's a bit dated now, but I remember the Talk Origins archive was a great place that had a lot of examples, just like common responses to, sort of creationist talking points or questions. So, like I said, if you've got that relationship, you have that conversation going, that might be good ways to kind of get them to think a little bit more,
Mhm.
not just at the big picture rejection or acceptance of a particular piece of big idea of what we understand, but finding something where they can get the mechanics of it, where it's like, by the very nature of the science, these things must happen, much like natural selection, in that we know individuals of a population vary, we know that those traits are genetically linked and those genes are passed on, and just by doing that, you get evolution. That's what evolution is. And they might like push back and say, well, that might explain micro changes, but not big ones. But it's at least a place to say, okay, this is basically an equation for how life works that, is basically indisputable. And it's a place to build from. So I like thinking in those terms of just like, what is an entry point to introduce them to things that are just so fundamentally obvious, or they may already accept,
Mhm.
that you can broaden from there.
Mhm. Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, we had a group that they're helping school districts bring comprehensive sex ed, and they tested some of their strategies on how they communicate it, and simply the framing of the conversation could actually change people's minds. So yeah, it requires I guess maybe like stepping outside of your own comfort zone. And I guess like I do this all the time.
Yeah.
I try to understand why these people that the politicians and elected officials
Mhm.
operate the way they do, and sometimes you have to like really get to know, like I look at these Moms for Liberty websites
Mhm,
and see what their trainings are so I can try to understand why are
mhm.
they advocating for things that make pretty much no sense. But it is very difficult. Um, there's just been so much praise in the chat for you, Riley. Everybody's really
Thank you.
grateful for this change in gears. And I try to end every Friday discussion with the question, what gives you hope?
So I love that you asked this because this was kind of the motivating reason behind the conclusion of the book. I took a road trip with my girlfriend and our dog to see Panda, which may or may not be the largest organism on the planet. It's an aspen clone that's about 3 hours from me here in Utah. And thinking about this organism that's been around since the Ice Age, it's over 11,000 years old, covers multiple football fields worth of area. Basically, was probably fed on and knew, mastodons and giant camels and things like that. It's still there. This ship of Theseus. That's a plant. And thinking about that sense of time and history and connection and what we can learn from our elders, and kind of took me back to the idea of, like, the seed bank in the soil, what's alive in the soil over these time frames. And that is what gives me hope, in the sense is that, as frustrating as our moment is in so many different ways, I love the fact that I can look back to people, I can talk to people now, I can look back through books and history to previous generations to look at, our elders who are feeling much the same way that we do now. I find a lot of hope in history, in that, not, there's obviously the sense of, like, yes, some things have changed and some things haven't, but that people are fighting the same fights. They felt like we do. They cared about the things that we do, and they found a way to keep pushing that door open a little bit, especially as a queer and trans woman right now. I find a lot of hope and looking to the experiences of people, from the 1980s, from the 1940s, from earlier, who were there, who were recording their experiences, who so much to relate to, and the fact that we are still here, that we're still going and trying and caring. That's really where I find my hope, is that, nothing is ever going to be, perfect, but through time and through experience, we do have these connections, that we're not alone in this moment or through history. And I love the sense that what we're doing now may be inspiring to whoever's next.
Right on. Well, that is a great way to lead us into the weekend. I appreciate you so much, Riley. I plan on spending one of my credits and getting your book on Audible because I can no longer read because it puts me to sleep immediately. So, um, thanks again, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I hope everybody else does too.
Same to
Take
you.
care.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.